As many of you know, I did serve as the executive director and counsel for the board back in the Middle Ages many decades ago. And I actually served as a consultant during the 1990s. And after a hiatus, I've appeared before the board a number of years. In more recent years, I have prepared a report which really tries to boil down to the central issue. I'm kind of a fundamentalist when it comes to this process. What the board should be considering, and I'm not suggesting that other factors should not be considered. Changes in population, anticipation about what's going to happen with the economy, certainly tenant income and affordability. But my fundamental view of this is that the board should try to, and it's admittedly a highly abstract exercise, try to create or estimate what normal market rents would look like if we had a normal market with a high vacancy rate. I think some of you know that the typical national vacancy rates over the last 10, 15 years have fluctuated between about 7 and 10%. They're now down to about 6.6%. Rental markets have tightened up somewhat, I think perhaps as a result of people, purchasing being a bit more of a reach. But nonetheless, New York has a clear housing shortage. It's driven by a number of things. It's expensive to build here, strict zoning, building codes, historic preservation, all of those things very laudable and certainly designed to preserve quality of life, but they have a negative impact on affordable housing. So there are government decisions which actually in some ways create and perpetuate conditions that benefit owners of existing structures and have caused a tremendous rise in value of those buildings, notwithstanding the presence of rent stabilization. The central figure that you all look at every year is the O&M to rent ratio, the operating cost to rent ratio, which at the beginning of rent stabilization, we've estimated, and the numbers aren't perfect, but based upon a number of ranges and using some fairly conservative assumptions, that back in 1969-70, the average owner spent about 62 cents of every rent dollar on operating costs. And given, there's been a change in the composition of the stock to some degree, I've always felt that if we stayed fairly close to the 62%, or if the board allowed it to rise very slowly over time, given the fact that it's my perception that the housing stock on average has aged. And I think research out there suggests that as the housing stock ages, operating cost to rent ratios will gradually creep up over time. And actually, that's one of the points that I'm really concerned about. And you'll note that I have 3 recommendations here, and they become increasingly urgent over time. I do think that the board needs to get a more precise handle on the effects of the aging of the housing stock on average operating costs. And that's something that should be looked at perhaps indirectly through HVS data, if required through a more intensive review of Department of Buildings data, and perhaps looking at block and lots and determining what the average age of a building was at a particular point in time using a statistically valid sample and looking at how that aging has changed in recent years. So the age of the stock is a relevant consideration. And I should back up here a little bit. You really have 2 functions. And I think actually the fact-finding and investigatory function is probably more important in some ways than the rent-setting function. The board in the last 4 or 5 years has done I think a pretty sturdy job of keeping rent adjustments in the ballpark of reason. There are a lot of factors at play. And I expect that the board will continue to do that. What I am most concerned about, and we see this writ large in the political battles that are going on in the country, is the shadows, the black boxes, the areas where the public doesn't have clear information. And this board, perhaps more than any other agency in city government, has done more to shed light on what's really happened with rent regulation than any other agency in the city, and perhaps even in the country. I mean, if anybody's studying rent regulation, looking at the work of the staff over the last 25, 30 years, we'll get a pretty good high-resolution picture of how it's really worked in the city, how this particular regulatory system functions. And the board needs to continue that and be creative and expansive to shed light in the remaining shadows. One of those shadows is, how is the stock aged, and how should that affect operating cost levels or relative O&M to rent ratios over time. The other thing has to do with the basic reliability of the income and expense information that you use. When I was at the board, when I started here back in 1988, we had to go to the Attorney General's office for co-op conversion filings to get profiles of income and expenses. We had the price index of operating costs, which is a real abstraction. It's a market basket of goods that didn't track reality in many ways. It was later adjusted, and we were able to tweak it and recognize its problems by comparing it to the income and expense data. And there was a report by Jim Hudson, I think 2014, which clearly set that out. So there was, in 1990, with the access to the Department of Finance data, there was a sort of a quantum leap into better understanding of what was really going on with the market. And the staff has done a number of special projects over the years and updated things, and I think the quality of work has always been excellent and reliable. I think you're very lucky to have the staff. But there, again, are these three areas. We need to know more about aging. The audits that are relied upon, we have this distinction, and it was mentioned by Oksana here, that the 65% assumption in constructing what's called the commensurate rent adjustment, which is kind of a general prediction of what is needed to keep owners whole, is not a sound assumption. I think, Andrew, you'd probably correct me that it's not exactly 65%, or it's a little bit higher, but there is clear evidence that owners tend to over-report expenses, or more likely put capital cost into the expense column when reporting their taxes, and under-report incomes. And the consequence of that is that the Department of Finance data, on average, is likely to be skewed in favor of showing less of a return than really exists. The audit was done back in '92. It was only 46 buildings. They were thoroughly looked at by the Department of Finance, and there was this fairly precise report on how these how the numbers could be skewed a little bit, and consequently there was this audit adjustment factor. So the owners have complained that, the audits are outdated and they don't reflect the reality, they don't reflect refinements and improvements in the reporting process to the Department of Finance. And the tenants have complained that, well, now you rely upon, to some extent, the unaudited costs, which are inherently suspect. Those audits have to be revisited. You have to do it again. They're now 26, 27 years old. And if you can't get the information through the Department of Finance, I think you need to call upon the Division of Housing and Community Renewal to issue subpoenas. The great invisible elephant in this room is the fact that owners know damn well how much money they're making, and they don't disclose it, and they never have. And they've always fought subpoena power on the part of the board. They don't want people to have a clear picture of what they're making because, frankly, they're doing very well. And every time you get to pull the curtain back just a little bit further, it's very clear that they're doing very well. And that's fine. That's fine, unless it's creating excessive rent burdens for tenants. And frankly, during the period of the recession from 2008 through about 2014, The guidelines of the board were so disconnected from the economic reality. And I think Oksana mentioned that the market rents were going up at a lower rate than rent-stabilized rents during that period. I think you had that number, if I'm not mistaken. It was around, in 2008, 2010, 2012. I thought you mentioned a number about well, take a look. If you find it, we'll get back to it. So I do think those audits absolutely need to be updated. And then the final thing is, and I think it might have been the chair who raised this last year, people legitimately say, well, look, you're looking at net operating incomes and you're looking at this relationship over time, but you're not looking at real profit. And real profit is something that's run by other independent variables that you don't have access to. You don't have jurisdiction really to get at those variables. You can, kind of construct surrogates. And that's a legitimate concern. I mean, there are two problems with that. One is that if the board tried to maintain constant profits, okay, and actually could get a number of what the return on investment is, then by increasing rents in order to maintain that level, the consequence would be that the purchase price or the value of those buildings would go up, because purchase prices and values are driven by rent levels. So you would have this circularity problem where, rents go up, purchase prices go up, or the cost of investing goes up, so rents have to go up further in order to maintain that same rate of return. So there is that circularity problem. But you can sort of get beyond that and get, I think, probably the best assessment of what's happening with rent-stabilized housing in terms of profitability. You won't get an exact figure, but just by looking at sales prices over time. And the board did this. I don't think it was a sufficiently extensive or refined study, but it was done back in the 1990s, and we did find that rent-stabilized buildings had a increase, I think, more than twice the rate of inflation. And I believe if you look at rent-stabilized buildings in the city, I'm sure they've increased faster than the national increases in real estate values. And I think that's a good surrogate for what's really happening in the market. And I don't think that it's the role of the board to do what this board did for about 6 or 8 years under the Bloomberg administration, which was to march to the market. There was some belief that there was something unholy or infirm or wrong-headed from a policy perspective about rent stabilization, and that was an ideological position that I believe drove the guidelines greatly to the detriment of tenants, creating huge windfalls for owners. And that's frankly what you're still dealing with. You're still dealing with the aftermath of that storm. In a way, a perfect storm, because we had the recession, which really hurt tenant incomes, unemployment being way up, incomes in great decline. Rents nationwide went down during that period, but rents in New York City, stabilized rents, galloped ahead because of really unwarranted increases, and I think, again, an ideologically driven process. And the consequence of that still echoes into what you're dealing with today. You have a price index of 5.5%, and I think people looking at that say, well, gee, owners should be getting, a big rent increase as a result of that. But the fact is that in the staff's own report shows that net operating income has risen over 50% in inflation-adjusted terms. It was 53.1% since 1990. And the chart that I have, which is at the back of what I've given you, is actually a far more conservative look at, at what has happened in terms of the effect of the decisions of this board. That's what I really try to focus on. increases in owner income, increases in, inflation-adjusted net operating income are driven by a number of factors that are not under the control of this board and that are driven by the legislative process. Deregulation, which I think has been a disaster for the city, but that's something that was, came from Albany. Major capital improvements. That's something that is now a matter of significant controversy, but that's the kind of increase that creates incentives for owners to improve their building systems. And frankly, it's why, contrary to what all of these economists say about how bad rent regulation is, it's why New York City housing stock is in better shape than it's ever been in the 40 or some odd years that it's been examined through the Housing and Vacancy Survey. Owners have tremendous incentives to improve their buildings. So taking major capital improvements out, taking statutory deregulation out, just looking at changes in operating costs as determined by the income and expense information, and for the last couple of years adjusted by the price index, because you have that lag time in the I&E data, and also looking at the consumer price index. Now, why look at the consumer price index? Why don't we just increase rents based upon changes in operating costs? Because the consequence of that would be a huge windfall for owners. Fact is, operating costs have gone up at about twice the rate of inflation. If you were to say a 5.5% increase in the price index suggests we get a 5.5% increase in rents, and you were to do that over a 25 or 30-year period, rents would be wildly excessive because owners would not be kept whole in terms of net operating income rising to keep pace with inflation, but net operating income would be rising at twice the rate of inflation. There's no reason for that. Just to keep owners whole, you would take a reliable O&M to rent ratio, which I think is around 59%, that's the audit adjusted ratio, and multiply it times the actual increase in costs, recognizing that the price index is not perfect. And then you would add to that the consumer price index times the net operating income level, which in this case would be 41%. And that would basically put owners in the same exact position economically that they were in the previous year. Yeah.
Excuse me, Tim, I just have a clarification. Are you talking about rent or income?
The
total building income or the total?
I'm using total building income.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. In terms of the ratio.
Yeah, in terms of the formula in the chart.
Right, but in terms of the rent index, what this board has done, and I'm looking, and this is where it's a critical distinction from what has previously been done. In looking at, I don't look at how much revenues have gone up for owners for their rental units or whatever. I look at what this board has authorized. How much rents would go up if the combination of 1- and 2-year leases and guidelines were fully taken by owners. And so this chart analyzes what this board has done in light of our best estimates of what how operating costs have changed.
So again, just for clarification, Tim, so if a landlord offers a preferential rent, and as we know that 30% of units are preferential rents, the actual, I'm just trying to make sure I understand this. So you're applying this to the legal rent, not to the actual preferential rent?
Actually, no. I understand where your question is going, and it's an excellent question. I want to get to that. The growth of preferential rents or rents that are collected that are below, or it's actually the change. Preferential rents generally go up consistently with the guidelines, but if the number of preferential rents or the depth of the preference changes over time, then what this board authorizes would probably exceed what some owners are taking. So I mean it's an important qualification. I actually mention it at the end of the report because nothing is perfect. But what I'm trying to do is ask the question, what was needed to keep owners whole, and what is the board authorized? And based upon that comparison, it's pretty clear, and I think it's a fairly robust result, that in order to keep owners whole since 1990, rents would have had to have gone up just over 166%. And in fact, this board authorized about 200% in rent increases. It's like 199.55. So the authorizations of this board exceeded what was necessary by nominally 33%, and in terms of, a ratio, it's about 20% each year of excessive rent increases, if you averaged it out that way. Now, of course, there are a couple of issues with this. This is not, in fact, what owners collect. Owners get the major capital improvements, owners get deregulated rents, and that sort of thing. So that's why the staff's report of the 51 or 53.1% increase in net operating income over time is in fact greater than what I'm suggesting here. I'm just focusing on what this board has done. And what this means is that owners, during the heart of the recession, collected grossly excessive rents, and I'm bordering on criminally excessive rents, given the impact on tenants. 60,000 homeless people, rent burdens at 36% median on average for rent-stabilized tenants, with something like a quarter or so, or a third, almost a third, paying over half of their incomes in rent. That didn't have to happen. And had the board, kept closer to its true mandate during those critical years, rents would be far less. That's why in 2014, when I came before the board, I said you have to roll rents back. The board didn't do that. I think the optics of a rollback seemed too stark and perhaps too radical, and I understand that, but I think the board needs to operate from principle and consider the impact on tenants and worry a little less about optics. And in fact, the entire trajectory of rent increases over the last couple of decades has been excessive, and there's no reason why this board should not adopt a freeze this year and hold rents back and continue to hold rents back until we get to that level where we know owners have been kept whole. There is a healthy relationship between operating costs and rental income. And tenants are protected as they should be. Now, I'm not somebody who comes before the board, and I've said repeatedly that your job is to make all rents affordable, nor is it clearly to make all buildings profitable. There will be low-income tenants who will not be able to afford rents, even in the most heavily regulated circumstances. So you can't do that. But what you can't do, and what you shouldn't do, and what is really, has been, in the past at least, a real abomination, is abandon the mandate to neutralize the effects of the shortage, to get rid of the excessive market power that owners have in order to allow tenants to at least pay a fair rent. And a fair rent is one that would exist in a normal market. Again, a tough target, but one which I think you can get close to. And I do think if you take these recommendations, study the changing aging of the housing stock, update those audits, and what was the third one? The audits, the housing stock, and I had one other.
Sales prices?
Sales prices, yeah. Sales prices, perhaps more important than the other two, because sales prices give you that sort of independent, reference point to say, how are these guys really doing? And, I know from examining one building in particular, it was an owner who brought a case that actually got to the doorstep of the U.S. Supreme Court, claiming that the fact that 3 of his, I believe, 7 units were under rent stabilization resulted in a regulatory taking. And when I looked at the history of that building and the purchase price back in the 1940s, it had been under rent control, and what it actually sold for, I guess it was about 8 or 10 years ago, the increase in value was phenomenal, vastly outstripping the consumer price index. I think it was more than double the national increase in real estate prices. This was an incredible investment, a brownstone, which benefited from the scarcity by design, which results in a major metropolitan area that's trying to maintain quality of life, and balance these issues of affordability against congestion and infrastructure issues. And so this owner benefited tremendously from public inputs and had the audacity to go to court and claim that his property was being taken. So we need to look behind the curtain more often. And I think that, again, these three areas the board should shed more light on. And I would hope that, I'm not going to be around forever, and I'd like to retire 10 years ago, but didn't happen. That this chart, for what it's worth, recognizing that it does have some issues, and the staff has looked at it before and corrected some of my math in the past. They do a better job than I do. Would become a regular feature in the staff's reports, because it does give that kind of global annualized commensurate. Thank you.
Thank you. Tim, I have lots of questions, but I just want to start with one, and then I want to turn it over to the other members. I would just like to drill down on your three suggestions, so you could give, I want to make sure I understand very concretely what you're suggesting we do. So the relative aging of the housing stock and the effect this has on operating cost to rent ratio. So I guess I have a question, and then I want to ask what we should do. So part of me thinks, doesn't that get implicitly incorporated into O&M? I mean, that if the stock is becoming more expensive to maintain or less expensive to maintain, isn't that just reflected in?
Absolutely, it does get incorporated, but here's the problem. The numbers that I looked at and they're rough, and they're not sufficiently precise from the HVS, shows that the housing stock on average is older today than it was 20 or 30 years ago. So I think you'd have to start in 1969. I think, and I'm not somebody who's a real expert in designing research projects, so maybe Jim Hudson or some others who can really jump in and develop something that's robust and reliable. My guess would be you'd have to look at actual lots, starting with lots, because the fact is some of the housing has disappeared. Some of that old housing has disappeared, and new housing has arrived. So if you just took a snapshot today, you might say, well, this housing is just newer, and it would, and you'd have to make sure that the adjustment in terms of getting an accurate picture of the average age or the range of ages of rent-stabilized or rent-regulated housing in 1969 it really reflects what was there, because some of that housing is gone. And then if you look at the housing stock today, so if you discover, for example, that the average, that a rent-stabilized unit on average is in a building that is now 25 years older than the average building was in 1969, and you say that the effect of aging results in a 0.1% increase in the O&M ratio each year, something like that. Then you could basically say that that O&M ratio probably should have risen slowly over time, and that could be more comfortable with its rise.
So just to understand, so you're saying if we effectively adopted your chart as our metric, you would acknowledge that we should adjust it for any change in the average age of the stock. Is that, I'm trying to understand why do we care that?
The chart is separate from this.
Okay, but then I don't understand why just our actual O&M numbers don't tell us what you are saying we should study.
I'm actually not speaking of O&M numbers in a descriptive way. I'm speaking of them in a prescriptive way. And what I mean by that is, I've always taken the position that since the average operating cost to rent ratio in 1970 was about 62, then that's kind of a rough and ready target for where the board should be. And that's why the audits are so important. We don't know if it's in fact 59 or it's 65. We really need to get a precise handle on that. So if the effect of aging in a normal market would cause that to rise over time, if the relative age is older, then your target might move up a little bit to say 64. So that has nothing to do with the chart. It's just about, what is your general direction in terms of where you want to see that.
So if we agreed that this baseline in 68 was the right base, or in the late 60s, early 70s was the right baseline, you're effectively saying, yeah, but you might also want to adjust it by this other factor to get to a better baseline.
And there are other things to be considered, and I'm
Okay.
sure the owners would bring their concerns to bear on this, that, they're going to tell you that, this was an old stock and so on, although this accounts for that. that they were coming out of years of rent control, and maybe the 62% is a little bit higher. In fact, the ratios in 69, 70, according, I think it was Rand that did the studies, were from 65 to 70% for the pre-war stock, which was largely under rent control, and 55 for the post-war stock. So the 62 is an average, a conservative average of those. You know, owners would say that, you know, that ratio should come down over time. Maybe you should go to 55. That's a healthy and enlightening discussion to have, because it really kind of gets you to the center of, you know, what the effects of the board's orders are and what is in fact a healthy real estate industry and rental market. When you combine that with changes in sales prices and increases in the value, you're getting a clearer picture of, you know, whether owners are doing well under the system.
Alex, are we going to say something?
So you're basically saying, trying to reset what the norm is in terms of operating costs as a percentage of income. Is that for what you're getting
I think
at?
the board has to have a discussion about what a healthy norm is. And you can look at a lot of things. You can look at return on other investments. You can look at, you know, what's the quality of the stock? Is there, you know, is it improving? Is the system working? You can look at, you know, whether or not there's sufficient interest, are buildings actually being sold, and that sort of thing. And you can look at how far is this away from what a normal or what a healthy market in New York City would look like if we had a healthy market. And I suspect that if we had a vacancy rate, I mean, the ideal thing is if we could somehow just shake everything up and plug in as this variable of, say, a vacancy rate of 8%, where would rents go in the city? What would returns look like under that? That's a really hard thing to imagine, but that's really the ultimate goal.
As to your second one, Tim, actual operating cost to rent ratios from income and expense data based upon updated audits of tax filings to more precisely identify areas of misreporting. If I'm understanding you correctly, I think the owners make the same point, that they think that we have really outdated.
Absolutely.
So part of me feels that tenants and owners both say it's wrong. Maybe that's not so terrible. I'm just saying that tongue in cheek. But what do you recommend, given the limited authority of this body, to get other people to act, other government agencies to act? Concretely, what do you suggest that we do? Just ask, or?
I was looking at this last night, and which was about 1 o'clock in the morning. Very busy day. And I double-checked a lot. I used to think that the Rent Guidelines Board, and I seem to recall somewhere, the Rent Guidelines Board had the power to call upon other agencies to support its research. The rent stabilization law itself says it has the power to call on HPD to actually assign staff and do things. But I didn't see anything with regard to other agencies. The Emergency Tenant Protection Act for the outer counties has the power to call upon the DHCR, which provides its support staff. I would think that, you know, I mean, look, the Department of Finance, and I would assume that Mayor de Blasio would be fully supportive, once voluntarily looked at these. Now, these were not enforcement type audits. I don't think any of these owners were, you know, fined or, you know, given some kind of penalty for what came out of those 46 buildings.
Right, and I think the larger buildings actually opted out. They decided I don't
The
think
larger
they
buildings didn't cooperate.
didn't cooperate, but there was no penalty for not
Right.
cooperating. Yeah.
Right, and they just refused it. And the audits, you know, have a problem because, again, as you know, one of the problems with the income and expense information is that buildings that are under, I guess, 11 units, 6 to 10 unit buildings or 6 to 11 are not included. So it would seem to me that ideally, I mean, if you could get DHCR to subpoena income and expense data from owners, a sample of buildings. And, you know, in DHCR, I don't know, subpoena power might seem a little heavy-handed, but the purpose is really informational. I would ask DHCR, you know, what can you do? You know, what can you provide for us? And And I would speak with the people at HPD and finance to see, can you revisit this? Can you give us a bigger sample? Maybe even look at the same buildings as a separate item, just to see if the rate of misreporting has changed, perhaps because of, improvements in the form and that sort of thing. Look, we have a fundamental problem that's going on. I don't want to sound preachy, but people seem to not give a damn about the facts, and they're more concerned about their agendas. If the audits hurt the arguments for the tenants because they shed new light suggesting that in fact owner operating costs are higher, then let it happen. Let it happen. Let's get the real information. Let's get rid of the spin and the speculation and the nonsense. And, frankly, the best way to do that would be to have subpoena power yourselves and just go right into it. And for every owner who tells you, they're losing money and, the board is killing them, well, put up or shut up. We've heard it for 25 years, and they don't disclose their income and expense information. I'm sorry.
And then, Tim, your last point, the general profitability of stabilized buildings as an investment as determined by relative change in sales prices. What is the easiest way for, if we were to want to adopt that, what would be what's in your recommendation, the easiest way to get that data?
I think you'd have to develop a research model. And I think that would require using some folks who really have high-powered statistical ability, but also people who are familiar with the real estate market and when changes. I can imagine trying to match, picking a random sample of block and lots for buildings that have 6 or more units. Okay, I'm just thinking loosely about this, and then taking that sample and looking at the buildings that were there in the 1970 or so, and then looking at the ACRIS files in terms of change of hands. There's going to be outliers because there's some family-to-family transfers. Maybe they sell the building for $10 or $1,000, in which case it's not a valid sales price. But where it's where the numbers seem to fit within the ballpark of change, then just track them over time. But I think you have to take individual buildings, because clearly you can't take one set of buildings from 1969 that's completely different from what you have in 2019. It's just not. It's going to be an apples to orange comparison.
Just one common sense point for me is that, I bought a house, a 3-family house, and the math had to work that I had to pay my mortgage. It was higher than just a single family house, and I had to. All these buildings that are being sold, banks are lending money for this.
Right.
Banks aren't lending money to anybody who the numbers don't match. Period. Now, they're not in that kind of business,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So every building that's being sold has to show an ability for not only them to make, but the bank themselves know, you're in a business, you need profit. So I know that every building that's sold is making a profit if the bank is making the loan, because the bank ain't gonna give you the money without it. So.
Yeah, and a good research model might factor in something like there is a very small sliver, and it's almost non-existent now, but it was more significant earlier, of abandonment where units go out, and how do you measure the increased value of that property over time? So that's something that you would have to adjust for, or at least flag and account for. But I think by and large, look, the vast majority of buildings are still standing, and many of them have changed hands a number of times. So you should be able to get a pretty good, gauge of.
If you just look at how much was the loan for, and just make some back number on it and say, if the loan is for so much, a bank has got to say so much of that money has to be to pay back the loan. So much of that money has to be for you. That's how you can more or less come up with a reasonable figure. That's how much is the profitability of that, because the bank isn't going to make the loan without that.
So Tim, imagining that the board, the staff was able to do this, and we got that number, where does that number fit into our analysis? How does that affect our final judgment?
I think it's just one star in the constellation where you can say, look, people are saying that owners are hurting or losing money. Since 1970, consumer price index has gone up X amount. Since 1970, real estate values for multifamily homes has gone up X amount. And in New York City, among the owners of rent-stabilized buildings, the value of those buildings has gone up Y amount or whatever, Z amount. And so that, I think it's, all of these things are imperfect. And it's really important to flag the imperfections as well, but they all shed further light. And we are in so much better shape here. I mean, I've spoken in Chicago, in Seattle, and in some cases, they don't have a clue as to what's really happening in their rental markets. I mean, they have some general ideas in terms of vacancy rates and, anecdotal evidence from what owners. You have a wonderful, kind of a roadmap of, where things have gone. You're missing a few critical signs.
You had mentioned in your testimony that you consider that a freeze, having come on the board and looked at one of the things I was showing was the recent increases, and not too long ago, there was a freeze. In fact, historically, the first time, correct?
Yeah, the second
Well,
year of the de Blasio
Right,
administration.
two successive
There were two in a year.
2 years.
In a row, yeah.
What's the argument that you could, because a landlord's going to say, hey, but, you've had these 2 successive years. If I'm going to say, well, I've heard the testimony.
The argument is that, and it's a tough one, and I know the optics are rough, and I know it might be a hard sell, but, sometimes the board has to be assertive in its position and say, look, we have looked at this, and it's very clear, whether it was 20% or 33% or 53.1%, that owners have been substantially overcompensated by our decisions over this period of time. And what we're trying to do is, tap the brakes, get it back, right the ship, or however, whatever metaphor you want to use. What's that?
Course correction.
Course correction. And unfortunately, it's taken this time because the excess was so large.
It's a little bit of a rhetorical question, but, so do you think all the other boards made incompetent decisions?
Yes.
Okay.
So Tim, your chart has obviously been the subject of a lot of conversation, at least the 2 previous years that I've been on the board, and given a lot of thought, obviously, first and foremost by you, definitely by the staff and the members, but also by the owners. And one of the critiques I remember from last year, I think, is that, you're starting with this base year of 1991, and they make the argument that that's a very bad base year to choose. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I don't think it's I don't think any base year would be perfect. I don't think it's a bad base year. There was a little dip in the market in terms of co-op conversions had declined somewhat, which suggests that there were some changes in the market going on. But owners were not hurting in 1990. And I think they were better off than they were in 1970. I'm sure they were better off than they were in 1970. Things had progressed enough. The guideline increases were really large in the late 70s and through much of the 80s. And the reality is that this is the first time that we've gotten income and expense information. And again, and I know this sounds polemical and kind of kind of testy, but the owners know what they were making back in 1970. If they want to have that base year, those who have owned those buildings, open the books. They should have done it back then. This is all we've got.
Well, yeah, I mean, 91 is when we got the RP, the income and expense statements. That's why Tim uses, to make it clear, that's why you go to 91.
That's the best data. That's the only data we have.
Exactly.
Yeah, but I don't think that that was such. It wasn't we weren't in the middle of a depression. I don't think that rents were falling.
We were in I'm trying to remember.
Not in the middle of a depression. There was. I'm not even sure it was a recession. There was a dip.
Yeah. Okay.
It was a dip. It was late. It was the Bush administration just before Clinton came on. The economy sagged a little bit, but I don't think that had a substantial effect on rents at that time.
But Tim, to your point though, so to 2008 though, those numbers are less than a percentage off.
To
To 2008, if you look at the chart.
I'm not sure which numbers are less than a percentage off. What are you looking at?
The last two columns.
The last two columns.
Hang on. Okay, 2008. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that just reinforces what I'm saying. 2008 was that last year when, we had that stability.
Right.
And the skewing starts after.
Yeah, and actually.
Now, remember, the board's actions in 2008 don't really start to show up in terms of income and expense consequences until 2009.
Yeah, so just a little history. Yeah, so in '08, we promulgated guidelines in June, and I think it was the fall when the recession hit.
Yeah.
And actually, I believe if you take '09 and '10 out.
And look at the guidelines in '08. Am I reading this correctly? Oh, 2009, even worse, 7.4%.
Yeah, that was the RGB rent index. Yeah, but that was the year of the low rent. The minimum rent.
Right, that's the
Yeah, that's
RGB.
why that
We're
it's
in the
not
middle
based
of a
on the
recession,
percentage.
and the combined effect of the
Right,
guidelines
but
is
my
almost
point is
8%.
to that is the guideline was set prior to that recession hitting. You can argue whether that was too high before that or not.
No, I'm looking at 2009, Andrew. Did I'm reading it correctly?
No, I know, and I'm not defending.
That's
but
the guideline in the spring.
That's going to be reflective because you're taking the guideline period of
Yeah,
October
I mean,
1st
I mean,
through
look at the
29
cumulative effects. I mean, I think that
September
it's-
30.
It's helpful to look at this. 2009, 7.46%, and then 5.21. And then we dipped down a little, 3.68. We're up to 4.39, 4.12, 4.06. That's the combined effect of 1 and 2 year leases and the vacancy allowance. Those are huge increases when rents.
No, I'm not suggesting they are. All I'm saying is that up to '08, it seemed like the board was, from this table, was on.
Yeah.
And then if running the numbers from 2011 on, we took a look at that, actually, and if you take out '09 and 2010, I think it's a percentage point from 11 going forward. You can't see that because because they're cumulative. But so '09 and 10 is, my point is '09 and 10 is where you're saying the board really went off the rails.
Yeah, if I.
Because it
looked at
impacted what's going forward from
That's probably
there.
a more precise targeting. If I looked at it more closely, I might agree with you. And I think it's important to consider that if you have that kind of a jump that early on in the recession, it gets compounded by the other increases.
Yeah,
And that's why
gets
we got
compounded.
this spread developed.
What happened with the unregulated apartments during that period of time? Do you know?
The rents went down in unregulated apartments because there was a recession.
Yeah,
In other words, that the rents went down at that point, and so maybe that kind of bolsters your argument about course correction in the sense that, bolsters your arguments about course correction if you have this huge 7% and then other rents went down, but then the other rents went up. Is there?
Right, and
I had never looked at that point before, but it's pretty dramatic, and it's actually pretty telling and interesting. I just had never really compared those two columns in that way. But it really does suggest that as of 2008, again, the board was damn close to perfect in
We're very
terms of
close.
keeping owners whole.
Right, and I think also if you took out '09 and '10, they would be very close again.
They would have stayed
Yeah, because
close.
we took a look from 2011 going forward to see how the board's been
Yeah.
doing. We were a percentage point higher. So the real issue was '09, '10, and it was a combination of the guideline plus also owners responding to a recession. So they lowered their expense. So price index measures what costs and prices went up.
Right.
The I&E measures what owners actually spent, which is a
Right.
very big difference. So the combination of that price index going up, but owners' costs rising 1% and 0.1% in those 2 years, that's where.
Yeah, I mean,
And-
you could be correct, but as you know, I'm using the income and expense data.
Yeah, I know.
So that's real data.
I just wanted to say that just to take a little deeper look into the numbers, that it was really
I mean,
That
it's
o-
quite
that 09
possible
and 10
that
is what
09
really-
and 10 were the major.
That's what threw
major
the,
points of departure, and maybe, but nonetheless, and I think what I would say is that the effects of that were apparent through through the following years. I mean, I was coming before the board at that point, my presentations were starting to get shrill. I was starting to really freak out about what the board was doing, and I think the cumulative effects, and I have a whole, kind of presentation on this. There was some information that had to be corrected, and that there was, projections and so on that were all done well and made in good faith, but were discovered to be overshooting the mark, and the board was given that information, 2013-14, or 2012-2013, and they ignored it. They ignored it. We showed them very precisely how the numbers had run askew, and I eliminated that from this particular report because I don't want to go back and revisit it every year. But the board had the information, and that's why I got so upset about it. It's not like it was an innocent error. They saw it, both eyes open, they marched right into it, and they continued to adopt guidelines that were excessive. And this board, has started the process, and it does show up in the numbers, that we're getting back to that closer balance between keeping owners whole and the guidelines that are authorized. And I think you need to continue in that direction for at least a few more years. And let me say something else. I mean, it would be painful, but if I came in here and I saw that you had not kept owners whole, and that owners were genuinely losing, I would say, look, in order to keep, for the integrity of the system, because I do defend the rent regulation system, you should have a 3 or 4%, 1-year guideline, maybe a 6 or 7% 2-year guideline. You certainly don't need it, not now.
Any other questions? No? Thank you, Tim.
Thank you very much.
Okay. I'm going to suggest that we take a few minutes break, and then, and then we'll, I don't know if anybody on the board has questions or comments, questions perhaps for Andrew about any of the documents that we've been provided, but we could have some time to talk about that.
right, and I think we need to just talk a little bit about the preliminary vote and what happens there for the new members.
Yeah,
and go over that as well.
Okay. All right. We'll reconvene in a little while.